Montecito's silence was shattered when unmarked SUVs rolled into Meghan Markle's estate. What began as a routine search turned into a nationwide mystery: industrial freezers, wrapped human-like figures, and a trail that leads deeper than anyone imagined. Today, we uncover what the FBI found behind those locked garage doors. It was the silence that fell, an oppressive, unnatural thing. Up in Montecito, where the early sun had not yet reached all the shadow-draped hedges and wet driveways of its swellest neighborhood. They grew up with the cold silence here, where secrecy was a rarity, worth more than the yellow metal hiding in its root cellar at night, scandal as impossible as snow falling in August. That peace would not last long as a column of unmarked SUVs rolled into the neighborhood. In the early morning light, less sleek and black than they were in truth, they slunk with a purpose that said their drivers weren't boys making deliveries, weren't just personal chauffeurs. The lead car stopped in front of a palatial estate and its tall gates, with the inclusion intended as a statement. The house was already a hive of public activity due to its famous owners Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. The estate had been documented by more lifestyle publications and carefully worded interviews than any other area of the singer's life, with one major exception: the garage. Behind the bland white door was something unphotogenic, not vulnerable to PR messaging at all, something that would produce a lot of blaring headlines. The announcement of the garage was not a decision made lightly. Teases had been making the rounds for weeks if not months. Rumors of strange, middle-of-the-night deliveries and the odd, nighttime hum, as well as a metallic scent that could be smelled for miles, which seemed to be salty, circulated. These little specifics meant nothing on their own. Still, as a whole, they raised enough eyebrows to be of some concern. Few people who knew that tip originated from a fired former employee or an inquisitive contractor, or even a nosy neighbor finally shedding his fear of getting involved. That one tip changed the game completely. A veteran investigator sat silently in one of the SUVs. Now his eyes were on the gate as it popped open. He had the warrant down cold, knew all the search conditions and assessed risks, pros and cons. The mandate itself appeared on paper to be a standard property inspection concerning discrepancies between storage and inventory. What they might find was an unknown, and unofficially this was a risky mission. The calm of the morning was shattered with a jar of boots on the cracked drive, waking up every single neighbor as the first officer strode away. It was followed by two more, each containing equipment cases with evidence. It was a little wrong, an industrial lock instead of what you might expect on a residential garage door. The locksmith that joined the team was shocked at how intricate the lock was, which proved it was not a regular off-the-shelf purchase. While officers cordoned off the street, the scene was quiet and peaceful, with no helicopters overhead or television camera crews. The intricate felicity of the tableau belied a barely suppressed sense that the weighty secrets secreted behind those hedges simply could not be held under lock and key forever. The lock clicked open with a metallic noise and the garage door raised slowly, as though half the frame did not wish for Marlin to cross its threshold. A cold breeze blew in, leaving behind a sense of solidness over the bright California morning. The inside was dim and concrete floors were lined with long shadows. Everywhere, the beam from an officer's flashlight crawled over shelves and toolboxes, across covered shapes in the corners until it hit on three huge industrial-grade freezers lined up neatly. The light reflected off of the wonderfully clean, showered-up, smooth-brushed steel surfaces. The freezers were larger than the standard size typically found in a household kitchen and looked too pristine to contain ordinary food items. The heavy plastic bands that are similar to the ones used in either medical or laboratory sealing enclosed each freezer tightly. His own breath frosted before him as he approached the first freezer. His free hand paused above the lid as though bracing himself for what was inside. A forensic photographer was not called out until every detail had been painstakingly documented. The placement of the freezers with the state of the bands, to how slow beads of ice water trailed down its sided when breaking the first seal, that crisp sound of plastic echoing in the room. Everything was carefully notated. The metal lid slowly lifted with a soft hiss of cold air, and the scene that appeared before me was not something simple to understand at one glance. Underneath layers and layers of heavy-duty industrial plastic wrap, there lay what was unmistakably a human-shaped figure, an outline of shoulders, arms and legs visible through the plastic. Everything was utterly motionless, dead silent, a stillness so sculpted by the hand of time that it seemed impregnable. A ripple of low whispers ran through them, a shared knowledge that this was something entirely different. One more pie in that mystery freezer faucet. Not a joke, not a gag, but an intentional mystery chair parade into the height of coldness. The tight, pristine wrapping gave an air of the meticulous effort to disguise the contents. The opening of the second freezer revealed a very similar figure in the almost identical sealed. In the third freezer, they found just as grim a scene: 3 body bags with human-shaped forms in them and no identifying marks. Sans tags, sans labels, sans any accoutrements other than the music itself. They looked as if they had been removed prior to being boxed. An officer gasped, fell backwards and lost the color in his face. Another officer muttered in disbelief. What kind of place was this? The answer eluded them all. Outside the garage, the neighborhood stirred, a dog barked in the silence. One curious neighbor was looking on from behind a curtain, aware something had gone unexpectedly. And none of them could imagine the depth of the mystery that lay behind those garage doors. The order had come: lock up the garage and get those freezers on site, to be whisked away to a secure forensic facility, where they faced a detailed examination. They were making every movement deliberate, slow, familiar, at least for now. But even then, the investigators knew the cover would soon blow off. But stories like that somehow manage to slip out, and a tornado ensues when they do. One more look at the garage and the head detective went to his car. In his long years as a craftsman, he had never seen anything like it. The accuracy, the extravagance, the absolute gall to be hiding such things in plain sight. It spoke to a mind that knew with certainty it would never be caught. The inquiries began to multiply. So whose bodies were in those freezers? They had been there for how long ago? Why were they found in the possession of someone connected to one of the most famous couples on Earth? For now, there was only speculation and uncertainty amid an uneasiness that all but the most experienced detective would have found troubling. The premises would see additional rummaging, electronics confiscated, financial documents perused, but the heart of the mystery remained locked in ice. They would later simply thaw. And within it, the reality. If there was one thing all the members of that team understood, it was this: whatever happened next, every other part would be secret and dead. There was every reason to believe this would be a story that manufactured its way onto the front pages and into political gun sites, and divided us all in two as it did, of course. This was a kind of revelation that resonates not only through the investigation but also across those whose sun rose higher, shining light on that garage in all its morning brilliance, drawing an almost impossible dichotomy between the idyllic world it projected and harsh truth it hid. What she didn't realize was, Meghan Markle was thousands of miles away from the property, shielded from an impending storm of headlines that would soon carry her name. But that pleasant state of ignorance was short-lived. As simple as the breaking of freezers was the point of no return. It started with a short, powerful phone call that no detective could ignore. His voice was quiet, deliberative, measured as if he weighted each of his words carefully. But the caller's information resonated quickly up the hierarchy without exposing who they were. The presence clued in, gravely as before: there are things in that garage, items that have no place inside of a home. Written off as the ravings of conspiracy theorists or gossipy neighbors, at first it wasn't heeded, but the tip had a disturbing gravity. Every single thing was recorded in the most minute detail before a forensic photographer was called for. Every movement was monitored, from the freezer's positions to the condition of the bands, to water droplets trickling down the outside whenever someone cut into the first seal, which created an ever so faint crisp snap as plastic faded away. The lid cracked open a slit, releasing a quiet hiss of freezing air, and the exact nature of what lay within emerged only gradually. Draped in large-scale industrial plastic, a shape that screamed hominid shoulders, arms, legs, grenade nestled within hot plastic folds, everything here was devoid of movement, soundless in an uncanny stillness that suggested preservation against the passing of time. There was a low murmur among the team, the majority realizing this was no ordinary turn of events. No joke, no prop, strategically left in that freezer, something enigmatic. The careful wrapping suggested a calculated attempt to hide the identity of what was inside. With the second freezer opened, another encased in plastic body appeared, and almost looked like a twin. The third freezer also contained a gruesome discovery, 3 plastic-wrapped bundles, each shaped like a human and unmarked with any identification. No tags, no labels, no tracing papers. It is as though they were scrubbed clean before and then covered. One officer recoiled, his face drained of color as he emitted a gasp. Another officer muttered in disbelief. What kind of place was this? The answer eluded them all. In the deep quiet of early morning, the rest of the neighborhood stirring about as a dog began its morning barking. From behind a curtain, curious resident looked out and had an inkling that something was not quite right. Neither could any of them begin to grasp the mystery lurking behind those garage doors. And so were the instructions to lock up the garage and prepare the freezers for transport, bound for a secure forensic facility where their contents would be meticulously scrutinized. Each was slow, deliberate, and subtle for now. And even then, the investigators knew that the veil of secrecy would soon be lifted. Stories like this naturally have a way of sneaking out into the wild, causing quite a storm when they do. The lead walked up to his car and glanced one last time behind him at the garage. In all of his he had never heard anything this cool. The precision, the luxury, the absolute brass of having these out in the open. It suggested a mind so bold and blasé that it could act without fear of being caught. The inquiries began to multiply. What humans were inside those fridges? For how long had they stayed inside? Smallest of all, why were they with a person associated to one of the largest stars in the world? At the very least, conjecture and questions, and a vague foreboding so ominous that seasoned investigators felt it unsettling. The location would be thoroughly examined, technology seized, transactions analyzed, but the heart remained locked in ice and steel, waiting for a warm-up. And within it, the reality. And if there was one thing those at table 11 all understood, it was that what lay ahead would be neither tidy nor quiet. This was going to be a sordid epic that would burst into full, forced, public view, royal political waters, and split the core of the nation. The kind of discovery that lingers far beyond the investigation and stays with everyone who gets caught up in it. The sun rose higher, drenched the garage in its early morning light, and, well, it became pretty difficult to reconcile that perfect image of what we showed to everybody else with the cold harshness locked inside. _lines Meghan Markle at the point would have been miles away from the property, blissfully unaware of a gathering shitstorm of headlines that just days later would rip across the media bearing her name. Unfortunately, all that innocent charm was not to last. Once the freezers were opened, there was no going back. The Washington Post, at Washington Post, May 29, 2020. It began on a short, insistent telephone call no investigator could ignore. The voice on the other end was low, meticulous in every syllable it pronounced. The call unveiled as much in a way that made its way up the chain faster than soon after a spy had made contact. Items that should never have been inside a house belong in that garage, said the voice solemnly. Written off at first as just the rantings of conspiracy nuts or meddlesome neighbors, this early tip carried a nagging ring of truth. He initially chalked it up to idle neighborhood gossip but then remembered something from a few months prior. One morning while running by the estate, he saw 2 of the workers taking a big rectangle-shaped thing from the back of their refrigerated truck. Wearing thick gloves and taking every precaution as if they were dealing with dangerous chemicals, it did not seem important then. But now, with the information available to him in hindsight, it looked like another key that most everyone else refused to see. By the time the investigative team pieced together a timeline, they concluded that a garage was converted into an industrial-strength cold locker some 13 months ago. Interestingly, this conversion took place while Meghan and Harry were often overseas, with the property being cared for by a skeleton crew. The procurement records were wrapped in so many layers of opaque shell corporations and third-party contractors, a standard practice for high-visibility figures who desire a layer of savvy deniability but buries the trail of traceable accountability. The more evidence the team collected, the less doubt they had. A petition for a search warrant referenced the suspicious deliveries, a series of eyewitness accounts and some unusual power consumption. Written with no mention of the targeting a particular group to sidestep baseless speculation, the warrant was all about suspected illegal storage of known biological agents in an unapproved facility. It was deliberate. The judge who issued and assigned it for review knew well how to handle delicate issues. They read through it twice, then sealed the deal with their signature and an unreadable face. Now that the ink is dry, what was a possible operation became a definite one. Logistics planning started early, with the decision made to attack during pre-dawn hours when few people would be out. It would consist of local law enforcement, with assistance from a specialized forensic unit that is trained to handle evidence that is sensitive to temperature. Their mission was simple: to covertly document whatever was in the garage, if anything. But many of the calls were incredibly vague and few people believed that the tip was credible. As one skeptical officer put it, "It's probably just an expensive wine cellar." The head detective shook his head, exclaiming, "We'll see soon enough." But I doubt that's the case. The evening before the search was thick with anticipation. Cars were readied and gassed up, evidence kits scrutinized. However, there remained a quiet unease, despite reassurances from those agreements. They knew, everyone on some level must have known, the specificity of such detailed pointers so rarely ended in nothing. But when it comes to Meghan Markle, any find, however tiny, would be played out for miles. What had started as a tip-off had become an operation on at least the scale of 500. The garage sat ready to expose its humanity, no longer a suspect with something to hide. They were no longer detectives working to confirm a rumor, but investigators gearing up to face the prospect of learning that beneath all the phony layers there was something far different, far worse, something that would crack their preconceptions on what and who things were. Well, the tip had done its job, the warrant acquired, and the team assembled. The elusive borderline was already on the horizon between speculation and reality. The operation started in an eerie hushed way typical to the sub-dawn hour. Montecito's streets were empty except for the occasional flickering of a porch light. This was intentional. The time chosen was designed to create a delay and minimize the chance of any problems. One night, a sleek convoy of unmarked SUVs came out in battle-red formation with their headlights slicing into the darkness, stealth-rotored engines purring softly to life. Drifters in every car, especially the soon-to-be surly passengers. The front vehicle of the convoy, which housed the lead investigator, the same person who attended this initial tip-off meeting a few weeks prior, drove out chili sauce on windscreen. He leaned forward, his hands hanging limp, staring at the massive structure materializing on the horizon. The plan was extremely well thought out, with every turn and position figured out the night before. The goal was plain and simple: infiltrate a location, secure the scene and properly document before other variables complicate things. Despite the dark and shadows, that gate at the property demanded a certain level of respect, gates beyond hedges so expertly tended they probably hadn't roughened to be badges of honor like those I claimed as scruffy sashes, safely hinting an order from without. Within it ruled privilege and intention for seclusion. The security team continued and reached the keypad of the gate using the code obtained from operational plan. The gates slid open silently, and the carriages glided through them onto the drive, stopping in some formation that was designed to block all potential escape routes. Each officer disembarked simultaneously. Here was no yelling and screaming of orders or bursting at the seams with loud headlines and aggressive gestures, just a well-mannered and slow process. It was that moment which needed a good head on the shoulders and not brute force. The officers fanned out, some approaching the front entrance and some taking positions at the sides of the property. When police arrived at the scene, they were met by the lead investigator and two forensic experts who were taken directly to the garage. The locksmith had been waiting, tools ready to go and a cloud of condensation following her out into the cold morning. The garage door was a palace compared to the rest of the neighborhood, sealed with an almost industrial loading bay blast gate. As the locksmith toiled away, an officer banged loudly on the front door and identified his position as a law enforcer. A household staffer, a middle-aged lady in a panic and wearing a dressing robe, appeared at the door. The interaction was brief. The warrant was flashed and the staff member was asked to move back as the family's private security managed the situation. Though they were diffident at first, but the security team agreed with the fact that everything was according to law. They looked tensioned but willing. One by one, as the tools of the locksmith clicked and turned them, they added instead to atmosphere of excitement already possessed by that room. The lock made a sharp metal noise and finally opened. Senior investigators motioned for the garage door to ascend, its mechanical moan echoing through the quiet, almost louder than it should have been at this hour. An unnatural cold wave rolled out into the early morning warmth as the door lifted. The forensic experts glanced furtively at each other. They could not deny the extreme temperature contrast. Flashlights penetrated the darkness and illuminated an unorganized yet eerie setting. There were no tools or storage boxes strewn about as there might have been in a garage. Everything was sealed and labeled, lined up in the industrial shelving that spanned from floor to ceiling. In the middle stood three huge freezers, which were visible even from afar, and which seemed to have no signs of past use. If it were not for the forensic photography shown on the screen, it would have been impossible to guess that these were freezers from a laboratory, morgue, or warehouse for the storage of industrial food. It was then that it finally became clear where the thick cables coming from the depths of the wall to an extra strong socket fastened to the wall went and which previously attracted so much his attention. The senior investigator slowly approached photographs and then stopped a few feet away. He showed with gestures. Then the forensic photography moved quickly. They photographed on all sides, the mysterious rooms, photographed the arrangement of the freezers, the state of the floor, with the moisture accumulating at the edges. It seemed that the sound of the camera shutter broke the silence. After a while, two divided officers from above from the space of the first freezer, resting their gloved hands gently on the lid. Cordless, they cut off the thick plastic security seal, and it fell to the ground with a dull thud. They opened the lid as slowly as possible, making for some type of torture show. Smoke rolled out of orifices. And there, wrapped up in thick plastic packaging, almost human in shape, was a figure, and no one said anything at that moment. The cluster was a perfect natural precision, there was no mistaking it for anything else. Shoulders and arms and legs, all there under the layers, giving everyone an intrinsic sense of knowing this was different. The same process repeated itself with the second and third freezers, also providing an identical scene. Dead as well, there were three beings, saved, enshrouded, anonymous, __. No tags, no records and no labels revealed who they were or why they lay here. Temperature readings and air samples were recorded by forensic specialists who moved through the garden with painstaking precision. Body cameras meticulously recorded every second in the garage, footage that would be crucial evidence. The constant buzz of the freezers buzzed through the air, its frozen hum like a cold mist that engulfed all in its presence. And in the property it was serene as ever outside. There were no reports of disturbances from officers, but curious residents in other estates looked out warily from behind their curtains. As the commotion grew, curiosities became impossibilities. A lone jogger slowed down, sensing the events that were all to every bit happening but kept their distance. As a result, it was decided to strap down and seal all the freezers for transport. There would be no rush, with orders for specialized equipment that could lift and lock the units in place on wheeled platforms sent out immediately. The first alarmingly heavy doors of the transport vehicle had closed around the first of its freezers, and that was by far one of the most dangerous steps in this operation. Under the watch of the senior investigator, every movement had been recorded, everything went perfectly according to plan. But the grim truth of the matter was starting to set in. Their items amounted to being more than things, they were individuals. People who were hiding out, part of their cash in a place no one would ever think to find them. The garage was shot again after the last freezer had been filled. This time, it was empty. The chill of the air still hung around, a stark reminder that something had recently occupied where I was standing. The authorities started clearing the property, taking care not to impact anything beyond what was stipulated in the warrant. The chief investigator took one last look up at the mansion before he entered his vehicle. He had executed countless search warrants throughout his career, but few would match the importance of this one. The site itself, who was associated with it, and the revelation of such a groundbreaking discovery meant it was ultimately only a matter of time. The convoy drove off, the sun barely peeping over the horizon, giving an orange wash to the perfect suburb. But for those in the vehicles, it did not feel warm at all, thanks to an unforgiving morning. The raid was done, but the investigation had only begun. Granted, what comes next is a little beyond the reaches of truth and secrecy or whatever was left unsaid. The early morning light was beginning to spill over the city as the convoy arrived at the secure forensic facility. It was an off-the-grid structure, no name, with restricted access and only a few employees permitted to work there by invitation. He lived in an obscure last house down a long road obscured by tall gates and walls of trees. The 3 industrial freezers in the room that have been pulled from Meghan Markle's garage were being opened once more, but this time this highly contained environment. The doors swung open with such a force that filled the entire building with an aroma of bleach that had been carried around quite heavily. Reinforced doors, each sealed with an electronic lock, led off the hallway to access specialized labs. Everything in this facility was precision, every move documented, each decision noted. The compressors hummed and echoed in the otherwise quiet room as they were wheeled into the expansive test chamber. The freezers stretched out before the experienced female lead forensic examiner who had worked in the field for over 20 years. A seasoned veteran of many human remains cases, she knew from the mere size and state of these particular units that they would present a special kind of problem. They give their team a truncated version and emphasize the importance of evidence over all else. Every individual freezer stayed sealed, having been tagged closed with secondary evidence banned since the prior undertaking, needing to be broken. They shot detailed high-resolution photos from every angle to catalog the condensation patterns, labels on manufacturing plates and even the lightest scratches along those handles. Again, such subtle details might be important depending on which aspects of the investigation turned out to concern the origin or procurement of the units. Freezer number 1 was chosen to be observed. 2 technicians, one on each side of the unit, the examiner retrieved the proper tools for carefully opening the case. A sharp snip and the evidence band was broken, a gentle lift of the lid dispersing a cloud of freezing vapor. All eyes shot to the bag as a silence swarmed among them. Within lay the anticipated sight. The raid team had described it as a lump in the shape of an individual, completely bound in thick plastic. The shapes were scarily detailed, the curve of a skull, the incline of shoulders, the taper of legs, all form-fitting and without seam gaps that meant someone was a pro at sealing in humans. The plastic was heavy, not see-through and really tightly wrapped in tape. The examiners nodded and the technicians gingerly hoisted out the body. Dressed head to toe in protective gear, they gently removed the form from the freezer and laid it on a stainless steel table. At its advance there came snippets of far-away popping plastic. First, they tested the soil with surface temperature measurements to ensure it was maintained at far below freezing. This was then followed by a slow, tear-open process. As each layer of tape was removed, a little more about what the thing really contained was unveiled. There was the ever so slight smell of a chemical in the air that the examiner quickly noticed and suspected to be some type of unnatural preservative not normally found in a normal mortuary. The one from the container was a stronger and more deeply rooted smell, obviously made to last. As the paper was peeled back ever so slowly, one specific element revealed itself, an element that created an undeniable tension in the room. In a twist too contrary to belief, the body was not clad in traditional burial clothes, as it seemed like the person originally wore everyday clothing, long-sleeved shirt, pants, and shoes. Generally, bodies reserved for burial or scientific research were undressed of these everyday clothes. The exception showed the person had been hastily moved into the freezer without the regular formalities. The team stood in a heavy silence as the final layer was peeled off. The body was that of a middle-aged adult male, his face unusually well reserved. There were no visible signs of external injury, but there was something too artificial about the subtle hints of color. The examiner came forward to examine meticulously, looking for unique features, an old scar at the left jawline, and rubber bands for his wrist birthmark. Once the images were taken, the body was tagged to identify it and then moved into a different section for an autopsy. Every step was carried out with precision, following strict custody protocols. The freezer containing the remains was emptied, scrubbed, and processed for any trace evidence before being sealed and logged into custody. The examination was equally detailed for the second freezer, going step by step, photographing, unsealing, opening lid, and releasing vapors. The bindings beneath the plastic were tied at the figure's wrists and ankles, a new curiosity from the second wrapped figure that was likely also a woman given its smaller size. Revelation, for the mood in the room had turned from mild curiosity to a strained unease at this point. An examiner instructed the crew to photograph the tightly rolled heavy nylon cord bindings prior to dismantling them. Expert knots secured those bindings, perhaps for restraining movements before preservation. To their shock, when they took off the last layer of plastic and saw what appeared to be a woman in her late 30s, eyes closed, skin pale but preserved, normal clothes, a basic dress and some flats. They put the bindings into bags and took photographs documenting exactly where they were. The inferences of these shackles sparked disturbing issues regarding the characters of those people dying. A third freezer at the far end of the room sealed their fate as well. The faint drone from its compressor only added to the suspense. The deal, while methodical, had an unmistakable skepped-out maneuver feel to it. When the lid was raised, another figure all wrapped, a wider, also probably male. Exposure of layered revealed the same preservation methods and industrial tape. A singles figure appeared, but with a standout difference: formal wear, only half the individual wearing what could only be described as a tuxedo. He had dressed for something. He had shiny shoes and a sealed envelope in his breast pocket. The examiner wanted to photo the envelope in place before removing it, because it had a date written on it in huge block letters. The meaning of this date was obscure, but it was soon marked up as key evidence. After removing all three bodies from the freezers, investigators focused on analyzing the units. We would track the serial numbers, manufacture information, and purchase histories with meticulous care. The interiors were dutifully swabbed to collect microscopic fibers, fingerprints, and chemical residues. The examiner stood there watching, and just took in the sight of the team working so diligently. In the garage of one of the three most photographed women in the world, they find hidden away ever so painstakingly maintained. While nothing was concrete with clear links or IDs or the missing people entries on the initial database search, whole preservation method, bindings and location all suggested a level of planning that could not simply be dismissed as accidental or coincidental. The questions started flooding in as soon as the insides were exposed, like some sacred seal broken by a slap of revelation. Who were these individuals? How did they get there, and more importantly, who put them in those freezers and why? The lead investigator, watching from behind a glass partition, knew that as soon this information was taken out of the bricks and mortar room it was sealed in, the investigation would be blown to pieces. The controlled setting of the laboratory was hermetically sealed off from the media, from the public and from the cesspool that was politics. Even given all this, he had to pull himself quickly together. The truth, even with its awful implications, had not come walking into his doorstep so that he could afford to be derailed by the weight of them. The morning sun was shining brightly outside as the team went to work, ready to prepare the bodies in earnest and begin detailed autopsies. The world remained ignorant of the gory find that had just been made. Not anymore, since the opening of the seals had marked an end to secrecy and the beginning of a process in which numerous other entities besides those operating within the forensic facility would become involved. They were already telling their story before the freezers were opened. Nearly half as wide as it stood tall, they were massive chunks of industrial engineering specifically designed not to resemble household appliances. Designed to protect delicate or perishable specimens from the ravages of time, their stainless steel yielded unweathered other than minor scratches along their bottoms where they had been placed. Those doing the lifting of these meters from its ex-royal subject's garage would have known that, each new at a cost of several $1,000s. The forensic examiner told me that this particular model was designed for medical labs, morgues, and parts of the food industry requiring extremely low temperatures. These were things that people needed to plan and save for, not just at the store but in sourcing them from specialized, hyper-local suppliers. The freezers plugged into a dedicated electrical circuit in the garage, with thick wire, and other features suggesting professional installation. Paying attention to little things because we needed every single unit to be able to run non-stop without overloading the system. The freezers, which were equipped with tamper-proof locks that are not typical in consumer-level models, still had those unbroken when police seized them. It meant only those with the keys and/or access codes to the freezers could use them. Teams of technicians pored over a long line of freezers, noting the make and model of every detail and following serial numbers to the original dealer. A little work involved, but the results were possibly going to open up the purchasers of these transactions that commodity paper was being functioned through, with multiple intermediaries making a very hard-to-follow third-party sale that clouded the chain of ownership. The empty insides divulged an amazing fact. Freezer walls, lined with thick insulation panels that were supposed to keep temperatures far below freezing. Without power, the shelves had been taken out and there was now enough room for an adult to lay down. For clarity, this arrangement was highly unusual and one which had been likely custom installed, often after sale, to serve a specific forensic purpose. Evidence of preservatives on the inner walls indicated someone was keeping them to prevent decay and potentially bacterial growth. The existence of these novel compounds suggested a unique industrial application, giving investigators yet another trail to follow. The freezers sat evenly spaced against the back wall of the garage, side by side in an orderly fashion that served to emphasize their design intent. Each unit had heavy rubber mats or anti-vibration pads between them and the building to minimize unnecessary vibration that might be carried into the building on top of the air, which could reduce sound transmissions. As well as a ventilation duct to control the temperature of the room, reinforcing that these systems are maintained in excellent condition to operate discreetly and efficiently. The investigation began due to anomalies in power consumption readings, showing that the freezers appeared to have been running non-stop for months and perhaps over a year. Either they had a very reliable backup power system, or they were lucky. In that corner of the garage, investigators found a small auxiliary power unit that could keep the freezers running during blackouts for a few hours. One major question that came about was how their freezers were delivered to the place, as the size and weight of freezers were enormous. These records showed that an unmarked truck had entered this neighborhood months before the investigation. The truck was traced back to a rental company in LA, but the rental contract under a temporary business name had been dissolved shortly after the delivery, suggesting an intentional effort to hide the delivery chain. There were no names on the workers that witnesses could recall, only their arched silhouette against the light of a low-hanging moon, dragging large crates at night to unload in the disused farmhouse. For the sound of a motorized pallet jack creaking up the driveway along with equipment being placed, residents recounted the only delivery had to be shrouded in secrecy. They said the delivery was surprisingly quiet, given that it contained large objects for the forensic facility. With a crane and blowtorch, technicians scoured every corner of the freezers for clues. They dusted for fingerprints, took DNA samples and examined every inch of the items down to the tiniest fiber that might have been picked up during possible transit. They managed to get a few partial prints off of the handles, but they were unsure if these belonged with the employees, the drivers, or another completely unknown source. Fibers found inside were gathered carefully for later analysis, where some of them seemed to come from the garments and some others were still unidentifiable. When a technician checked the second freezer from underneath, he made an odd discovery. A frozen pudding sat atop the base, and beneath it was a small sealed pouch with a sheet of paper. The pouch was carefully retrieved, catalogued, and revealed under very strict confines. Inside that was a roster that looked as though it had a series of dates and certain initials. It was tidy handwriting, but he and the others in the room did not recognize it. The list meant very little, yet the fact it had been hidden in so random a location suggested it to be of consequence. They were no longer just passive storage units, not just freezers, they were participants in the drama that had ensued prior to everything snowballing into action. Their formation, placement, adaptations and contents each served to offer pieces of a bigger story. Absent a unified narrative, they were only so many excerpts without coherence. Soon, it would not only be about where the freezers came from but also who delivered them to the clinic and who was authorized to access them, that every detail about the freezers must relate back to the larger investigation, Carr said. Each bit of information that came in narrowed or widened the pool of suspects. The media was not even in the know yet, so time was of the essence to gather everything before it is inevitably leaked. At the moment, the freezers reclined in the evidence bay, their tops glowing beneath fluorescent light and their interiors empty. They looked unoffending giant, expensive tech stuffs waiting to be stashed away. But that void was misleading for anyone who knew what used to be inside them. They knew that these machines were also the crypts of 3 nameless men, entombed behind a cloak of secrecy until the Montecito garage door went up. Assessment of the units by physical means had finished, but forensics would take weeks to parse all the information. Each piece required intense scrutiny, chemical analyses, fiber identifications, and evaluation of electrical performance logs. Every evaluation might yield another piece to the puzzle, or, perhaps, bring an entirely new set of questions. As the technicians finished and stepped back, one placed a gloved hand on the cold steel of freezer number 1. It was one of those silent moments where I acknowledged that this wasn't just your normal investigation. Machines will lack the capacity to hide knowledge, but people will not. However, sometimes these devices keep them more than we ever planned. This was obviously not something I discovered in one quick moment of revelation, but a series of shocks revealed themselves one after another. I had gotten a little taste of what was in the bags during the garage search, but it wasn't until I stood in full view and unwrapped the mangled bodies under those awful glaring lights that my eyes understood. The irrefutable truth arose there out of the shadows and dimensionless. A note in this diary states that the cops found everything intact and locked with only $12 money missing, and spells out various other weird noises coming from some of the rooms before they left searching for another time, but I don't remember their name because could hardly hear all of them at once. Who knows when this event really took place. Body 1, adult male in his early 40s, untie, in caricature counters, feed BS 214. He looked almost unnaturally well preserved to the naked eye, still human-colored beneath his chemically preserved paleness. His hair was kept short and dark brown, meaning he had not been in the freezer long enough for much decomp. It was bare and undamaged, looked as though he was wearing orange material on his feet, short dark pants, perhaps a long-sleeve shirt. She couldn't see any external wounds or signs of violence, at least none on the outside. For the examiner, it was above all the face of this man that hits him. His body was frozen in death, but his face looked almost peaceful, jaw relaxed and lips gently parted. It looked as the tranquil face of one who had died in their sleep would describe, but the examiner knew better than to assume anything until the autopsy could give authentic answers. Yet their lack of visible trauma suggested they could have died in a manner that is barely detectable on the body, or, alternatively, somebody went to great lengths to remove any signs of it. The first body was a grim curiosity, but the second body sparked an uneasy silence throughout the room. The person was a skinny woman in her late 30s. The girl had medium-length hair in a casual braid, and was wearing a light summer dress with simple flats. Her wrists and ankles bore the prints of tightly wrapped nylon cord, identical to the remains that still bound her beneath layers of industrial plastic, unlike those encasing this man. The skin around these bindings had contused, indicating that they were positioned before death. That one observation was a huge turn in the case. Had that been the result of some bad luck or natural misfortune, the second body suggested restraint, imprisonment, and something sinister. Yet the preservatives used by her captors to keep the skin from rotting had not been able to hide entirely that she was a captive. All photographs of the bindings were taken in detail and from all points of view, and the cords are preserved separately for further fiber as well as DNA analysis at next stage. The third body to feel the touch of daylight at Roche Caron was the most unusual of all, a full-sized man in an immaculately tailored suit and shiny shoes, dressed as if he had been prepared for public viewing. His hair was combed, fingernails cut. The more interesting single item discovered as of now had been his closed envelope, with a date written in thick block letters and secreted within the front pocket of his coat. The date did not correspond to any public records event, nor did it match the timeline of when the freezers were believed to have been installed. His forehead was dusted with several layers of beard, completely unharmed. Yet as the examiner dared to look behind his ears and along the edge of his scalp, a small patch of discoloration caught her eye. As she came closer, she noticed a light bluish tint on the side of the neck, an early sign of possible asphyxiation or another form of oxygen deprivation that would have to be verified at autopsy. At this point, the personal details of all three people flagged serious questions. Not a one had ID of any kind, and the brand tags on their clothes, including Bono's, had been meticulously removed. There were no wallets, no jewelry, nor any other personal effects that could be used to tie the remains to a particular place or identity. It was no coincidence that their absence. They had been so carefully drafted into the freezers by whichever individual that any remaining link with the external world was removed. The chief investigator took detailed notes in the viewing area as he watched the creation of God Corvina from behind a glass partition, where particles suspended in the air are nearly as sharp as knives. Which years of law enforcement experience had taught him was a revelation that could open up in all sorts of unpredictable ways. Multiple victims in same place meant a single killer revisiting the crime scene or more than one conspirator, acting as a disciplined unit. The bodies being kept showed pre-planning and investment of resources rather than spur-of-the-moment behavior. The forensic photographer continued to shoot the crime scene images, paying close attention to every angle as they documented the peripheries, capturing skin in strategic pockets of preservation solution and just under the surface, detail work of dry wrappings and indentations left by bindings. That detection area worked with a computer which took photos of tape as it was pulled, and pored over the images for hours searching for telltale signs in everything from the weave of the fabric to how the tape was ripped. Technicians collected hair samples they sent for possible trace DNA from unidentified contacts and painstakingly scraped under the nails of the victims. The preservation approaches had reduced the likelihood of biological material transfer, but it was still possible to retrieve trace amounts of skin cells, fibers, or other environmental particles in late processing stages. At the same time, a separate team was hard at work cross-referencing missing persons reports, first on a local level but then extending their search across the country and around the world. They searched for possible candidates by reading physical descriptions, estimated ages, and specific markings. The first searches brought no definite results, and some potential candidates were put aside for further investigation. A team, following strict evidence protocols, then opened an envelope found in the pocket of a third victim after obtaining dental records and perusing DNA information. It was a rolled-up piece of paper with a short set of numbers and letters that looked like the date on the envelope, also written in block lettering. It was not immediately a standard phone number, address, or common identification code of that format. What the artifact said was ambiguous. It could be a cipher, a code, or just a bunch of gibberish. Although the paper seemed like regular writing paper, the ink was similar to that of industrial labeling and printers, not what a consumer would use in their pens. Whatever was in that mysterious envelope, the fact of its existence and presence opened a new chapter. Drenched in mystery, the object was catalogued and sent to another division for further examination with high-definition scans. As the preliminary examination took place, a psychological atmosphere in the lab changed from methodical to burlesque. Everyone in the room knew just what they were growing up against. These weren't merely things left behind physically, they were the halting lives of people long associated with one of the most famous families on Earth. To the outside world, nothing amiss was occurring inside the forensic work. Internally, however, the team knew that the secret was too big to hold on to forever. As soon as provisional conclusions were reached, the corresponding agencies and authorities would have to be notified, increasing the risk of information falling into the wrong hands of journalists. We were only newly in the revelation stage. Full autopsies, toxicology testing, and extensive forensic examination would take weeks to complete. But through the labyrinth of details, one basic fact emerged: 3 unidentified persons went to meticulous pains to obscure their identity, and they disappeared in a place too unsuspecting for the principal investigators to find. The greatest problem was no longer ascertaining the contents of those refrigeration units, but rather uncovering why that forensic inquiry had begun so soon after discovery in the dark heart of a secure base. The autopsy rooms were set up for one of the most complicated investigations the team had seen. The continued preservation of all 3 bodies beyond normal decay limits presented a problem and an opportunity. Though the preservatives could tamper with some tests, the lack of decomposition made for a level of scrutiny at an undrained level. An experienced pathologist credited for his precision, the chief medical examiner assigned a team to examine every body. In the meantime, every action was monitored by several cameras being documented for legal and evidential purposes. The aims were to determine the cause of death, predict the time of death, and establish any unique characteristics that could help link with missing persons records. The first body, a man in his 40s, was laid out under full clinical lights. External examination performed initially, including height, weight, estimated, and any visible marks on body. In this case, the preservation process preserved some of the structure of her muscles, allowing for a fairly accurate estimation of body mass to be made, figure 3, though there was evidence of an apparently faint scar around the jawline during unwrapping, along with absence of both tattoos and other scars. The examiner also indicated some slight bluishness of the fingers just beneath the nails, which he said could represent cyanosis or a lack of oxygen. Underneath the nails, even tiny samples were found under microscopy to reveal any fibers that might tell us about a struggle or the environment. The deeper the internal exploration went, the more complexity emerged. There was minimal fluid in the lungs that were not typical of drowning but indicative of an acute respiratory event. There were no signs of chronic disease, and the heart muscle looked normal. They then started toxicology screenings to find out substances which can cause respiratory arrest. Although freezing and preservative agents affect blood samples, enough material remained for analysis, which was immediately sent to the unit's own toxicology lab at another facility for mass spectrometry and identification of trace substances. The second person to come forward, a woman who was bound at the time of discovery, made headlines. Under high magnification, a close inspection of the nylon cord used as a ligature showed that it had been taut and minimally looped around itself on the bottom portion of the sticks, figure 5. Skin impressions pointed out that she had been tied for a while previous to her demise. These bruises went too deep, she was still alive in these bindings. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma or penetrating injuries, however subtle neck compression landmarks suggested possible asphyxiation. It was not specified what the method would be, manually or with an object. Swabs of her wrists and ankles found trace materials or skin cells on the binding. Her stomach contents showed she had eaten a meal not long before her death. This could help to pin down a time of death even closer after more evidence is gathered, since the body did not decompose. There were still the mysteries of the third body, that of the well-dressed man who had an envelope. There was no evidence of ligature, injuries or hands/arms in a defensive position, but the internal exam confirmed earlier surface observations of blue discoloration around his neck as post-mortem petechial hemorrhages and microhemorrhage under the jawline, which would be consistent with mild to moderate asphyxiation. His clothes were clean, but some stray fibers were found upon forensic examination on the suit jacket that did not match the fabric of his outfit. Additional investigation into these fibers might also suggest a separate location from where his body was found. The envelope, full of ciphertext, was sent to a code cracker in the forensic unit. The initial examinations revealed the absence of fingerprints on the paper, but an ink composition associated with industrial labeling systems used for shipping and inventory management. Breaking the code could reveal where they were from, or when they were killed, or any kind of common identifier between the victims. So they got going with autopsies and very detailed chemical preservational fixes on the skins. Identification and quantity gas chromatography testing confirmed the presence of a combination of cryoprotectant and antifreeze compounds typically used in biological research. The chemical agents, while they were successful at preserving the tissues long-term, are not something routinely present in civilian areas and would need to be sourced. If purchased in bulk, following the recon from these compounds can potentially isolate the list of suspects. Concurrently with the autopsies, a different lab team forensically examined the freezers. These areas were swabbed and analyses revealed some minor traces of hair, which did not belong to the victims, in addition to a few small pieces described as skin slippage. These samples were uploaded to both national and international databases for biological evidence profiles. While the searches there came back with no matches, there still may be something to learn from those partial profiles obtained. Further in the inquiry, the 3 victims' clothing was examined for fibers and particles, revealing tiny starchy specks of a fine, pale powder on the cuffs of the woman's dress and trouser turnings of man. Under the microscope, the dust was revealed as a gypsum and silica mixture typically found at construction sites or unfinished basements. This would suggest the victim was somewhere in a place that is being built or under renovation. Early results found that the initial victim had a tiny sliver of an ultrapotent, largely unfamiliar laboratory-made sedative in their system. There was also a suggestion that the sedative included ethanol at some confused level of the process, possibly having been drunk by the victim before he had been rendered helpless. However, the third victim had no sedative, but low levels of carbon monoxide in the blood indicated he might have died from smothering without any obvious indication of trauma. Based on the findings in this report, we were led to believe that although all 3 deaths may have been related, they could not have used the same methods. This variation suggested that at least different perpetrators had learned to use different tactics, or each victim had its own unique story. These have made it difficult to construct a single story that links all the victims. In the original laboratory, the supervising researcher reviewed the first reports. The timeline was still scattered, but I started to see a few key points coming together. The victims, it seemed, were probably kept for some days prior to being killed. The deaths appeared to be intentional rather than accidental, and the refined process of preservation hinted at a methodical, practiced hand. The motivation was foggy at best. Were they to hide, to test, for ransom gone wrong, or was it all some ulterior business? The equipment, the pro-gear chemicals, and all that Prep told me this was not a random hoser with a jug of crystal stuff he picked up at the Walgreens. As the sun set and the day's work slowly wound down, a palatable heaviness had filled the air around the team as they all labored under the burden of their troubling discoveries. Every item of evidence drew them deeper into a case that had long since extended far beyond the bounds of an ordinary murder inquiry. It was no longer about identifying victims or determining cause of death. Now, it was all about putting together the details of an elaborate web, of an intricate logistic scheme and associated decision-making that had led to 3 people hiding in a Montecito garage. The forensic examination provided some but generated even more questions of its own, ones that threatened to lead the investigation outside secure walls. The probe was low-key for a few days after the raid. Freezers were locked up in the forensic facility, autopsies had started during the week, and only a handful of people in Jackson knew exactly what was found in Meghan Markle's garage. But secrecy in such situations is ephemeral. A slip of the tongue, an accidental conversation, or even a cunning informer could easily break through the wall of silence. It quietly began in a dim corner of a popular after-work hangout for courthouse employees, at least 4 steps beyond the noisy bar. A junior technician sat at the duty desk of the facility, dog-tired after a punishingly long shift, and whispered surreptitiously to someone they considered an ally. While he didn't outright mention Meghan Markle's name, the tech described a weird arrangement of freezers and suggested food was not inside. This was enough for their mutual confidant to start figuring it out. It did not take long at all for those murmurs to reach the ears of a local freelance journalist with a bombastic record of peddling unchecked, salacious stories. Biographers did not have the smoking gun, but they had enough to start snooping around. They messaged a shipping company contact, claiming to be an investigator, and asked about large shipments to important Montecito spots. Although they had no outright confirmation, they did have somewhat of a lead that this house had taken in an odd shipment months previous. By the 3rd day, this little story jumped a group of gossip bloggers who exist within half a dozen WhatsApp groups sharing stolen celebrity content. These bloggers, unhampered by ambiguity, lived in possibilities. On a less moderated forum post, they got word that law enforcement had dug something up at Mark's garage and that it was something so large in scope as to be able to cause an international incident. The post blew up, inspiring countless screenshots and retellings on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, each one a juicier iteration of the last, all leading to #GarageRaid and #FrozenSecrets trending by midday. Although no posts mentioned bodies, the rumors took on an almost mythical quality, shrouded in a sort of enigma. The shortage of real details meant that people would rush in to fill the void with their own speculation, fueling interest in the case. The ringleader frothed at the mouth, steadfast in their commitment to confidentiality. They could see it slipping away. With the media descending on the town, and a fear of witness tampering, evidence contamination, and suspects heading for the hills. A meeting was held with the district attorney to plan mitigations. The DA urged against making any public statements right away, worried that even small revelations might set off a firestorm. But the silence that followed has only stoked all kinds of fevered speculation. At the end of the week, one large British tabloid published a front-page headline that read, "Mystery Freezers in Montecito Mansion." The piece, attributed to anonymous law enforcement sources, claimed large refrigeration units had been taken from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's home during a court-sanctioned search. Even though the article itself never mentioned anything about human remains, it heavily implied there was found something disquieting. The story was then picked up by UK media and eventually American news outlets, spurring Hope Hicks to force the White House counsel to deny it. TV talk shows took up the case, arguing over whether the unsubstantiated gossip was a malicious smear campaign or part of a real criminal investigation. The story was out there, and now beyond reeling in. At the time, representatives for Meghan and Harry's communications team clapped back with a brief statement denying any accusations against the couple and calling the reports a calculated smear campaign based on misleading and harmful misinformation. They warned that they would prosecute any media organizations that disseminated false accusations and defamation of them. This denial did not prevent the. If you found this report as chilling as we did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is only the beginning, stay tuned for the truth.